So, February is Black History Month, a time when we celebrate the contributions, past and present, of Black Canadians in all aspects of our society. So, all this month, we'll be showcasing the efforts of those who have helped shape the fabric of our own community here in Windsor, Essex. And joining us today is Irene Moore Davis, well known local author, educator, and historian. Irene is the current president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, as well as a contributor to a book called Fluid Frontier: Slavery, Resistance, and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderland. And she was also the co executive producer of a documentary called The North Was Our Canaan. And she was co executive producer on that with Heidi Jacobs, who is a local historian and librarian at the University of Windsor. So, welcome to the program here, and thanks for being here today, Irene.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell me a little bit about your role as a local Black historian. I mean, that's something that covers a wide range of subject matter. I'm sure. Are there some specific aspects of Black history that you've been focusing your attention on?
You know, that's one of my problems. It's really hard to focus on just one. It's all so fascinating. And I love to study the history, frankly, of slavery in Essex County and Upper Canada. I look at the Underground Railroad history quite extensively. But I'm also interested in women's history and the history of organizations and clubs forming and how people resisted racism in every generation, and our whole history of emancipation celebrations and ongoing activism through the years. So those would be my favorite topics to study.
So where has that taken you? I know we talked about some of the projects that you've worked on. Are there some other ones that you're focusing your attention on now?
Yeah, for sure. I'm finishing up a book right now, which is about the entire Black history of Windsor and Sandwich from the 18th century to the present. And with Heidi Jacobs, I'm co-executive producing another documentary called Across the River to Freedom. And that looks more specifically at some particular families in Sandwich and in the Black community and their history, their Genesis stories or origin stories, I suppose, how they came here, why they came here, what they accomplished once they got here, why it's important, why we should care. So those are some of the things that I've been focusing on lately. But I would also say I've been working with Heidi Jacobs again and a number of people through the University of Windsor. I'm employed at St. Clair College, but I do a lot of partnering with people at the University of Windsor and, of course, the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. We've been working with a wonderful graduate student named Willow Key, who is investigating the history of the McDougall Street corridor, which was once, people don't realize, a pretty thriving Black business district and residential district that got dismantled in the mid 20th century due to urban renewal, which was happening in a lot of cities. And unfortunately, when that happened, even though there were nice new buildings and things, a lot of that core, the heart and soul of the community was lost. So she's been investigating that with lots of supervision and feedback and input. And we're really looking forward to seeing all of the research that's coming out of that project as well about what those institutions and organizations and businesses were and what that community really thought of that space and what it meant when it was taken away.
So we referenced some of the other projects that you worked on and some of the ones that you're currently working on. Tell us about your sources of information. When you first set out on this path, was it difficult finding sources of reliable information for you to track, or is there a lot of information available? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
There's a lot of information out there if you have the time and the patience to look for it. I mean, I would say that my best sources of information on many of the projects that I work on are people from our community who have leads, who have information, who have stories to tell, ancestral stories, stories that their parents and grandparents told them. Or if they're older folks, it could be the stories that, the real life history that they experienced themselves. And from that, you can look further and do the research to either prove that what they're saying is correct, or perhaps do some refining if they have a certain kind of memory, but you're finding that the documents suggest something a little different. But it's always great to start with those personal stories. And I feel as though even when I'm telling the history, even when I'm talking or writing about people that I never met who existed generations ago, I really sort of hear them in my head the way that I would hear a character or the way that I would interview someone today. And I like to convey their story as stories because I find people relate so much better to them that way.
So, in all the research that you've conducted, what are some of the things that have really sort of caught your attention, or maybe surprised or startled you most, that gave you some kind of perhaps those kind of eureka moments when you're doing that kind of research?
I'd say kind of the farther back the story is, the more startling it tends to be. Not always, though. Let me give you a couple of examples. I mean, I always grew up knowing through my parents and my grandparents and people in the circle of historians and history-minded people around our family that slavery existed in Canada. I knew that was a thing. I knew that there were enslaved people right here in Windsor and Essex County. I didn't know much about that. And as I've gone farther into the research, I've realized how many of the founding families, as we consider them, were slaveholding families. I've realized more and more that the enslaved people who were here were involved not only in agriculture or just, taking care of a home, but involved in the fur trade, involved in commercial businesses, involved in various skill areas. I've learned about how many transactions happen and how these individuals were sort of traded back and forth from family to family. And I've learned, little individual things about them to whatever extent possible, even if it's a story of an enslaved woman in the early 19th century, before slavery was fully abolished, remembering songs from her original African language. That was recorded by one of the Bobby daughters. So those little things that give us this ability to humanize and empathize with and understand these people who lived in our community, but who are often forgotten, that makes such a difference. When I look at the Underground Railroad history, we've often been sort of given this version of the history that involves kindly abolitionists, usually of European descent, kind of handing enslaved people back and forth from point A to point B and helping them get to freedom. There's not so much a focus in the widespread literature about people's agency and how much involvement they had to have in taking the risk and taking these long journeys, and often doing a lot of it unassisted. But getting into those narratives of the first generation of people who came here and seeing, the interviews that were transcribed with them, with researchers who came to study how Black people were doing in Canada once they were free, we can hear more of their own voices and hear them relate the stories of how they got here, and realize just how much they had to take on to make those journeys. And just in closing, when I look at what they did once they got here, these formerly enslaved people, so many of them, as soon as they were able to get settled, get a home, find some work, they immediately wanted to put their kids in school. Education was of the utmost importance. Their families had been robbed of it in America in the system of slavery. And when they found that schools were barred to them, when they found that there was segregation or maybe schooling wasn't available, they used every means to get schools in place. They pooled their resources. They wrote to the government. They used the courts even to engage in lawsuits. They got into petitions and really did what they could to fight for the right to education for their kids. And that's just so compelling to me.
That is fascinating. So, in terms of your own family history, how much of that is sort of interconnected with the local historical research that you're doing?
You know what? I've always been very, very fortunate growing up in a family where we had a strong sense of our history. We had lots of old photos, lots of storytelling, very specific details. My grandmother especially was an avid storyteller in terms of the family history. My grandfather was too, but mostly my grandmother. And so, I got to hear a lot about these individuals. And as I've been engaging in research, it's always fun and heartwarming and encouraging when I come across my relatives, my family members, my ancestors who are part of Black history. They're part of the wider story. I look at somebody like Marianne Shadd Carey, who was my great, 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 great aunt. No, that's not true. I've given her one great too many, but she was a pretty impressive individual. Right here in Windsor, she was the first woman in Canada to publish a newspaper and the first Black woman in all of North America to publish a newspaper. I look at somebody like James Llewellyn Dunn, who was a Black business owner who had been born to formerly enslaved parents from Kentucky, and his rise to affluence through his, initiative and entrepreneurial skills and all of that, his decision to sue the Windsor Board of Education, the competitors, for the right to send his daughter Jane to the school that the white children were attending. He wasn't successful in that lawsuit, but he got the best revenge and became a school board trustee and then worked to overturn segregation. And there's a new school being named after him later this year. I mean, those are some of the fun family stories that also have a direct impact on Canadian history. And, it's always so lovely to come across those and to see that there are other people researching them too.
So this may seem like a kind of a foolish question, but I get paid to ask them. But especially to somebody like yourself who's so entrenched in historical research. But having a specific month for Black History Month, why do you think that's so important?
Well, it's funny. I'm feeling different ways about it depending on the day. I think that Black History Month is an opportunity to tap into the way that people think. What do I mean by that? We have a tendency to prioritize things if there's a commemoration built around it, right? When we have an International Day of Observance, or when we have a week that is dedicated to a certain cause, if we have a month that's all about one theme, there's a tendency to focus resources and energy and attention and to catch people's attention and to make sure that they're listening. And so there's value in that. But there's a part of me too that thinks that Black history should be part of our conversations 365 days a year. And there's some growing feelings about that in the wider community, that Black history 365 is the direction in which we should head. And it would be nice to see, for example, Black history built into the curriculum on a complete integrated basis throughout the year. When we're talking about military service, make sure that we're touching on Black Canadians in the military. When we're talking about settlers, let's look at those Black pioneers who were part of this community early on as well, and so on. So I think that we can do both. It's great to have a month of focus for sure, but I don't want us to ignore Black history the other 11 months of the year.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so much of it, I think, is when we look at profiling certain individuals, who sort of advanced the cause, as it were, that seems to be kind of an essential part of it. When you were growing up, did you have any particular Black role models that you sort of aspired to, that you look up to? Who inspired you as a young lady?
When I was growing up, certainly there was still, even though he had passed away before I was born, there was still a great amount of discussion of Dr. Martin Luther King, for sure, in the American context, and Rosa Parks and people like that. But I have to say, my parents, I was very fortunate. They had a real worldview when it came to Black history and people of African descent. They were really African diaspora people. So they would tell me about, the first leaders of independent nations in Africa. And they would talk to me about how Haiti became an independent country and everything that was involved in that. They would talk to me as well about African American history, like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and those kinds of folks. So I was very interested in them. But, we also just had amazing role models around us. My grandparents' friends were the people who, as teenagers, had integrated local institutions and had fought against segregation, here in Windsor and Essex County, had, worked to desegregate hotels and restaurants and things like that. So they were role models too, to hear those stories from people who actually had those lived experiences right here. That was huge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how do you feel about the current state of race relations, both locally on kind of a national and maybe even international level? What sort of troubles you, and what gives you reason to feel hopeful?
Yeah, it's possible to feel simultaneously troubled and hopeful, right? We're lying to ourselves if we believe that there are no race relations issues. I sometimes hear people say, "Oh, there's no racism in Windsor, or there's no real racism in Canada," and I always, try to look at them through eyes of compassion and not judgment.
Mhm.
I'm not always successful. But the reality is there are still many vestiges of anti-Black racism that have remained pervasive. We may not see them all the time. We may not have those overt, shocking incidents to the same extent that we might see in, our neighboring nation. But there are issues that continue here. We know that there are, for example, despite the best efforts of many great educators, there are still some things built into the K-12 school system and even the post-secondary school system that disadvantage kids of African descent. We have to keep working on that. We know that there is overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. We know that there is underrepresentation in many areas of employment, despite equivalent academic credentials or achievement. There are a number of things that we've got to keep working on, and turning I don't want to say that. I want to say ignoring them doesn't help us. We have to confront them head on. But I will say, perhaps as a result of shocking and upsetting things that have been in the news the last couple of years, be it Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, or even some cases here in Canada, there does seem to be greater receptivity to having the necessary discussions to move things forward. But we've got to get from the talking piece to the acting phase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you take a look around it, whether it's traditional media or social media, particularly when you try to have discussions with people about some of these issues, it seems that it's more divisive than ever when it comes to race relations. It's easy to sort of jump to that conclusion. I don't know if in reality it really is that bad out there, but what gives you a reason for hope? What are you seeing out there that makes you feel that maybe we are kind of moving the needle a little bit in terms of race relations?
I think young people give me hope to a large extent. I find that there's a great deal of openness to having the necessary conversations among our young people, be it in the high schools or the college, university, or elsewhere. I find that there are a lot of people who are very open in terms of having friendships and relationships with people of all backgrounds. But I simultaneously have to say that embracing multiculturalism is not the same as confronting racism. And sometimes I will hear young people say, oh, I have friends of every shade. I have friends of every gender. I have friends of every background. That's cool. But it doesn't exempt you from still carrying within you some thoughts and some values that you may not even realize that you have. When we've grown up in a system where we separate people into social hierarchies based on race or ethnicity or religion or whatever it is, it's really, really easy to kind of fall prey to those beliefs and not even realize that we have them. So we've got to all examine our implicit bias and keep working to be better people and keep working to build a better world.
So one of the things that I often hear from people is that we need to educate ourselves. That what does that mean to you? What does that sort of process of self-examination look like?
I think we have to kind of understand our reactions to things. And, for those of us who are educators, we believe in being reflective educators, but I think it's great to be reflective people, outside of just your profession. I think when we have an experience, we should spend a little bit of time unpacking why we reacted that way. Why did you pull your purse closer to your body when you went by that gentleman, on the street? Why did you feel suspicious or tense when you approached that group of young people? Why did you have certain assumptions? Monitor yourself, think about it, and then engage in the learning that's necessary to understand why you might have some of those attitudes. It's not your fault. We all have biases, but we can keep working to dismantle them. And in terms of education, my goodness, there's never been greater access to sources of reliable, helpful, well-vetted information about racism and anti-racism. Lots of great resources all over the web, lots of great books that are out. I sometimes make a joke that in 2020, anti-racism books flew off the shelves, but I'm not sure that people really read them. But if you have one in your house, then pull it off the shelf and read it now, even if you didn't. It's never too late. Lots of documentaries, on the streaming services and so on that can help to teach you about race and racism and what has created these systems, but also what we can do about them. So there's really no excuse to be completely uneducated about these things in this day and age. There's tons of information out there.
And you did mention a little bit earlier something about the K to 12 school system, and this is something obviously that as a school board we examine a lot. In the last year, we've seen some movement in terms of, de-streaming at the grade 9 math level. What are some other things that you can think of that perhaps, we can be doing in our classrooms to move things along?
I think part of it is just being really intentional about representation. I think that textbooks are a lot better now than they were, my goodness, when I was growing up. But I mean, that's to be expected. But even if you don't see a lot of representation in the materials that you're given, you're putting together PowerPoint slides, you're putting together materials, you're preparing a lesson of some kind. Grab some examples of people of African descent, of Middle Eastern descent, of other racial categories, indigenous people that are in these professions that you're talking about, that had some sort of involvement in the topic that you're discussing. Even if you're a science or a math teacher, mention intentionally and with meaningful ways, mention some Black or indigenous or other racialized inventors or scientists or engineers. Just make sure that those examples are there. If we can see it, we can be it, is something that people often say. And there are so many kids that make it entirely through the school system, never having encountered someone who looked like them, who's in certain professions. They can, go through an entire 12 years or 13 years or whatever of formal education, never realizing that there are people who look like them in these various fields. And I think that, on a day-to-day basis, there's so much that we can do to overcome those challenges just by including those examples. We can't have guest speakers all the time, but we can at least refer to people, even if it's just sort of the bridge in at the start of your lesson. If you're telling a story to get people into the lesson, make sure that those stories include other folks that look like everybody in this country.
Great advice. Listen, Irene, I could carry this conversation on for hours. I'm sure this has really been a fascinating discussion. I just want to thank you for taking part in this and being available for us here today.
Thank you. Happy Black History Month.
Thank you.